Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you back. We regret the delay in starting, but I'm sure we'll have you borne with us with this delay. But welcome you all on this important discussion on a very topical issue. That's the Indo-Pacific, a region that's really picked up a lot of extreme dynamics for a long time to come. And I think while this has been discussed in several forums by the US with regional powers as well as other global powers, the aim today was to identify what the challenges are and where do we go from here. This event has been co-hosted by the Professor M.L.Sondhi Institute of Asia-Pacific Affairs and the IPCS Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. And before I begin, I would welcome our special panelists today, Ambassador Kawal Sibal, who's been our Foreign Secretary and needs no introduction, Professor Ashok Kapoor from the Waterloo University in Canada, and of course, I am in touch with you all. And request Dr. Vivekanand Sondhi, who represents the Asia Pacific Institute, to say a few words before I take it.
Friends, on behalf of M.L.Sondhi Institute for Asia Pacific Affairs, it is my privilege to welcome you to today's panel discussion. The Indo-Pacific region looks increasingly as though it will be witness to the great dramas of the 21st century. This is an epic shift from the 20th century in which the two world wars, the end of colonialism and the Cold War had all involved Europe in a central fashion. The M.L.Sondhi Institute for Asia-Pacific Affairs was established in 2002 and was concerned with the wide grouping of Asian countries from West Asia to East Asia plus the Pacific littoral, both in order to understand the dynamics of this wider region and to examine the possibilities of a more active Indian role in the region. In this broader perspective, we remain true to the intentions of our founder director, the late Professor M.L.Sondhi of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was also, as some of this audience may remember, a UPSC topper, and as a member of Indian Foreign Service, served in Czechoslovakia and the United Nations, but resigned after 6 years in preference for an academic cum political career. In terms of political engagement, he was elected member of the 4th Lok Sabha from New Delhi and was a senior leader of the Bharatiya Janata Party. He published a seminal study on India's foreign policy entitled Non-Appeasement in 1972, in which he challenged the received Indian foreign policy framework, pointing to an evolving world order and shifting centers of power and conflicts such as we have gathered to discuss here today. I quote from the book, Non-Appeasement, the concentration of the use of terms South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia by political analysts has strengthened the tendency to focus on the instability of international and intranational relationships in each of these regions. This approach has resulted in the subtraction of the major factor of, as he called, oceanic orientation of political geography of the countries stretching from India via Indonesia to Japan. Oceanic concepts and approaches have been subdued in India's Asian policies, yet a framework of political, economic, and strategic arrangement exists in embryonic form, which can exert a more direct influence as soon as Indian policymakers decide not to confine themselves to a subcontinental politics and develop policies in the direction of regional integration in Oceanic Asia." Unquote. In a lighter, more anecdotal vein, I may mention the efforts he made to bring the Indian Ocean to public attention. Immediately after getting elected to the Lok Sabha in winter of 1967, he made a visit to Tamil Nadu to reach out to the DMK. He also addressed a press conference on the need for Indian strategic thinkers to go beyond their unifocal obsession with the Northwest and Himalayas and to look at the Indian Ocean, which surrounds so much of her landmass and which shaped so much of her history, both pre-colonial and colonial. Seeing the surprises on the faces of his listeners, he suggested they imagine the map of India upside down to understand India's strategic position, and 2 decades later, in 1982, he held a a seminar, in fact, at India International Center on the Indian Ocean, during which the map of India was indeed shown upside down throughout the proceedings. In the backdrop of the recent attack in Pulwama and subsequent events, it's worth recalling the attack on the Indian Parliament in December 2001 by Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba operatives. It led to an Indian response in Operation Parakram and a denouement with General Musharraf, who, as a result of international pressure, in his speech on January 12, 2002, promised, amongst other things, action on terror groups sponsored by Pakistan. In an essay entitled Coercive Diplomacy Beyond Deterrence, Professor Sondhi published soon after, his advice, much of it still relevant, was, and I quote, Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee should be thinking about a strategy and policy that recognizes the importance of the role of the armed forces in the formulation of effective coercive diplomacy vis-à-vis Pakistan and its supporters in America and China. Secondly, he should think about new initiatives to consolidate the recent gains. Coercive diplomacy is as much about war as it is about propaganda, where psychological warfare is used to mislead and to panic the leadership into a wrong assessment and a wrong policy. To shape the second round, which will inevitably happen in a few months, Indian practitioners will have to understand the crucial parameters in which Indian coercive diplomacy functions. What are the parameters that India should keep in mind as it takes the lead in Kashmir, Indo-Pakistan, and international affairs? How can India create a fabric of military, diplomatic, and political movement in dealing with audiences in the Indian Ocean area, China, and US, Russia, and Europe? Is there a single end game which culminates with the acceptance of the LOC as the international border? There are, in fact, several end games that require a combination of military strategy, psychological warfare, diplomatic work, and political work to develop a sound Indian foreign policy and Indian strategy. The challenge is huge because it requires the Indian Premier and his inner circle not to project India with the mindset and policies of a landlocked country as Nehru did, despite the powerful messages about the importance of sea power in Asian history by K.M. Panikkar. Instead, India should be projected as a land as well as a sea power with a continental and an oceanic vision and policy that goes beyond Pakistan, beyond China, and beyond nuclear deterrence, unquote. With regards to today's panel of discussants, Professor Sondhi had enjoyed both personal and professional friendships with Ambassador Sibal and Professor Ashok Kapoor. He also had engaged with Mr. P.R. Chari and IPCS on several occasions, and this relationship continued after the formation of the M.L.Sondhi Trust, and in 2010, the M.L.Sondhi Prize for International Politics was awarded to the IPCS. We are delighted to continue our relationship with IPCS and with General Lamba. I now look forward to the presentations of our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Dr. Vivekanand. I must also welcome Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi, who's with us today and a senior member of the same organization, institute, and the trust. We welcome you and we are privileged to have you here, ma'am. Getting on to the first session, I think in our first session we have Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, who addresses us on the geopolitics, challenges, and implications. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, General Lama. And thank you, Madhuri, for this invitation. We have discussed in so many forums the whole concept of Indo-Pacific, almost threadbare. It's very difficult to attempt to give some fresh insights into this concept in terms of geopolitics, challenges, and implications. On the table, there's so many people who are experienced in foreign policy and have also served in some of these countries which form the Indo-Pacific broadly, that makes my task even more difficult. But let me see what I can do in terms of giving you my thoughts on the Indo-Pacific and the geopolitics challenges and implications. One, of course, is this Indo-Pacific concept is a very new one. nobody talked about the Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical concept until Prime Minister Abe, without using the word Indo-Pacific, projected this the diamond of democracies and the Asian democracies coming together and forging some relationship in order to deal with the strategic challenges which essentially China is projecting in this region. The Americans have been late in terms of accepting this concept, because if you remember when Obama came here and the joint vision statement was signed, it referred to the Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean regions, not the Indo-Pacific. Now, of course, there has been a considerable evolution in US thinking, and they're referring now to Indo-Pacific, and not only that, very importantly, they have renamed their Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command. So, actually, for the Americans, the Indo-Pacific idea as such has always been there, because their command in the Honolulu looks after both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So they have operated on that basis. And when we started the Malabar exercises with them in the 90s, even then, the whole idea was to, for the Americans to see if India and the US and their respective navies could build up progressively linkages and eventually interoperability. But with what in mind? Clearly, it couldn't be for its own sake. So the whole idea was to look after the maritime security of the Indian Ocean together, because the Indian Ocean is one in which we have very vital lines of sea lanes of communication, carry so much of trade and oil and commodities, etc., etc. So in a practical sense, the germ of the Indo-Pacific lies in the Indo-US cooperation through the Malabar exercise. The fact is that as China has risen and China's rise is no longer seen as peaceful, and China's bid for power on the international stage has become so much more obvious, there's been mounting concern about how to handle China. And that has given a fillip to the Indo-Pacific concept and broadened the basis of this concept, with Japan being roped in and eventually being accepted as a permanent participant in the Malabar exercises. And independently of that, because of Japan's own rising tensions with China, Japan has also tried to come closer to India and vice versa, in terms also of developing bilateral relationship in a way that strengthens the capacity of both countries to counter some of China's moves in this region. And this is demonstrated by the connectivity projects which Japan is now supporting in terms of India's Act East policy and strengthening relationship towards the East. There are some issues here, because one, can the rise of China be effectively countered by the configuration that is being created? It's an open question. Now, all the countries which are worried about China's rise also have very strong relationship with China. The United States and China are the biggest trade partners. Japan is now the biggest trade partner of China if you look at both imports and exports. In other countries in the region, Korea, the biggest partner of China. ASEAN has a huge relationship with China. Our own relationship with China, even on the trade front, however unbalanced it may be, very considerable. So to what extent, in practical terms, in a longer term perspective, the countries who are worried about China's rise can actually devise means of cooperation in various domains which are looking at containing China. Because you have to do a very careful balancing exercise, all countries concerned, that you both try and contain China as well as find ways of cooperating with China and managing the China relationship. And this is an acute problem even for India. The other aspect is that if China has to be contained, it has to be a much broader geopolitical exercise. It's not simply the Indo-Pacific concept that can do it. Because China is present on all continents. Not present in Europe in a big way, in a very big way in Africa, even in Latin America. Some of the major Latin American countries, including Brazil, are the biggest trade partners of China. And the China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is extremely ambitious, has given China the potential to geopolitically extend itself across the world and create dependencies, link the economies of many countries to the Chinese economy, and therefore create political constituencies in a lot of countries which will give China huge space for maneuver politically on the global stage and its bid for power. I don't think that Africa and Latin America can be effectively roped in to deal with China's rise. But Europe is very critical because Europe is part of the transatlantic alliance. America is now very open with regard to its concerns about China. So to what extent Europe is willing to participate actively in the Indo-Pacific concept. France has shown its interest in cooperating with India with this in mind. China's spread of influence and capacities in the Indian Ocean area. And France is filling up an important gap in this concept because the Indo-Pacific concept, which is the American Indo-Pacific concept, which is linked to the mandate of the US Indo-Pacific Command, doesn't cover the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea. It stops at the eastern coast of India. So the whole of the western coast of India right up to the Gulf is not under the mandate of the US Indo-Pacific Command. So there are two implications. One is that for us, the biggest threat to our security, maritime and other, is in the Western Indian Ocean. The Bay of Bengal is peaceful, but the problem is on the east, on the west. So, and then there is the whole Southern Indian Ocean, which goes right down to the littoral of Africa, where China is placing itself very strongly on the ground. And here France can play a very useful role and is playing a very useful role. We signed a joint strategic vision for the Indian Ocean with France. And I have on good authority that actually we have gone very far in terms of our political discussions with France with regard to sharing of responsibilities in this area in terms of maritime security, the passage of Chinese ships and submarines or whatever else through the Madagascar Channel or what have you. Germany is, at least in terms of their diplomatic stance, paying a lot of attention to China's maritime activity in the Indian Ocean, though they have no capacity to directly intervene in some form or the other. They are inclined to do so, but under the EU flag, not independently of the EU. The EU is involved in a limited way in anti-piracy stuff in the Gulf of Aden, but whether they have the means and the capacity to actually participate in a meaningful way in combined efforts to ensure maritime security in the Indian Ocean is doubtful at present. Now, coming back to China, which is at the center of the concerns in the Indo-Pacific. First of all, China's navy is expanding phenomenally. And they have this ambition to have 351 combat ships by 2020. Their defense budget, $175 billion, is only second to that of the United States of America. They've already demonstrated their willingness to take enormous political and military risks in the South China Sea with the confidence that they'll be able to get away with it, which is what has happened. They have militarized all these reefs in the South China Sea, placed their missiles and their created runways for their military combat aircraft. In other words, they have created for themselves static aircraft carriers right in the South China Sea so they can dominate the maritime area and the airspace in this area. But that's not all. Their 2017 maritime strategy envisages the creation of a blue water navy. They have created a naval base in Djibouti, and those who've been studying Chinese naval movements are quite impressed at the rapid way in which not only have they modernized their ships, but they're learning naval tactics and everything else. The next naval base is bound to be Gwadar. There's no doubt about it. It will happen sooner rather than later. And China's maritime strategy has as part of its concrete ambitions to take control of vital ports, not only in the Indian Ocean, but in Europe and elsewhere. Apparently they are now managing 90 ports. But in our area, the amount of money they have spent, the amount of attention they have been given to Sri Lanka, for example, it's not justified for any other reason except geopolitical reasons. And their attempt to acquire potentially ports and even, if you like, naval facilities in Maldives, we are aware of that. The other problem with the Indo-Pacific concept from our point of view, since we are talking also of the challenges, is that it is only limited to the maritime domain, and that also truncated because it doesn't cover the Arabian Sea. But China's expansion and its rise and the capacity it is developing to challenge the United States is not limited to the maritime area. In fact, they are relatively weak in the maritime area. It's on the landmass of Asia that they have expanded so rapidly with the BRI and all the projects that they have been financing, and their ambitions to tie up connectivity to have connectivity with Europe itself. And the 16+1 dialogue they started with members of the European Union and the Balkan states. United States is nowhere in the picture. The only hold they have in this part of the world is in Afghanistan, where it is weakening and they actually want to walk out of Afghanistan. So the whole Eurasian landmass is free for China to exert its dominance. And China has covered its flank with Russia, because Russia has been weakened as it is, and weakened further by US and European sanctions, and has therefore strengthened its strategic ties with China. And therefore China doesn't have to worry about a Russian challenge to its land ambitions in Asia, or its hegemonic ambitions in Asia. And then China is connecting its progressive hold over the Asian landmass with its maritime strategy in the Indian Ocean, with connectivity projects through Myanmar to the Bay of Bengal and through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. So where does it place us? It puts us in a vice, in a Chinese vice, and creates enormous security problems for us. Now, what we can perhaps protect our security in the maritime area in better cooperation with the United States, but the United States is not going to get involved in China's challenge to us on the land, because their position has always been clear that they're not going to take sides in territorial disputes. The only concern is that these disputes should not be settled by force. Other than that, they don't take a position. So we can't count on them. So we have to deal with China's threat on our borders on our own. The other problem for us which is developing is that Russia, which had all along been a steady partner of India, and geopolitically really we had no conflict with Russia, which is why the relationship has remained very stable over so many decades. But Russia is now openly against the Indo-Pacific concept. They believe that this is bloc politics, and countries should not get engaged in bloc politics. They're also very supportive of the BRI. And in fact, their foreign minister, when he came here last October, told us in as many words that India should find some way of accommodating itself to the BRI, and spoke openly about their reservations about the Indo-Pacific concept. Furthermore, with their overtures to Pakistan, notwithstanding our sensitivities and concerns, and their policy in Afghanistan by reaching out to the Taliban, adds to our geopolitical difficulties and challenges in this area. A few points. Japan. Now we have relied a lot upon Japan as a strong partner in the Indo-Pacific, etc., etc. But if you look at Abe's last visit to China, they have supported the BRI. In fact, their company signed 52 projects, BRI projects, on that occasion. When confronted with what this means, the Japanese say that, this is fine, we've done this, and we are willing to participate in BRI projects because our companies take these decisions and they push for this. But we have laid 4 conditions, and they spell out what the conditions are: transparency, economic viability, etc., etc. The sort of things we have said about the BRI. That may be all right, but the symbolism of this is extremely important, that they go ahead and in fact endorse the concept of the BRI, but conditioned upon certain requirements. Which then brings me to Prime Minister Shangri-La speech, which has created quite a bit of stir, at least in the think tank circles. They question very sharply India's commitment to the Indo-Pacific concept, because the Prime Minister in his Shangri-La speech talked about it not being a strategic concept, being inclusive, not directed against any country, etc., etc. So the question is India, again, from their point of view, playing the usual games of sitting on the fence and as they see, India has a China challenge. And yet India is not ready to come forward and take decisions which would give a sense of commitment to the others with regard to our belief in this Indo-Pacific concept. I have looked at this speech in some detail. Yes, it's a very statesman-like speech, and it would have obviously gone down very well in Singapore, with the ASEAN. And maybe the intention was to give a sense of comfort to the ASEAN that India is not proposing a new element in the regional security architecture in Asia which leaves the ASEAN out. And if the ASEAN's support for, if the ASEAN begins to have serious doubts about what we are trying to do in the Indo-Pacific and the concept that is being developed, then it will be a problem for us in terms of countering China. So to keep ASEAN happy, some of these things were said. And I think finally what the Prime Minister would have had in mind is what I began by saying, that each country, while they are hedging against China, is also very conscious of the need to maintain a certain equilibrium in the relationship with China. So if we went out on a limb on the assumption that this concept gives us a sense of security and the other countries go and deal with China, find borders with and deal with it, then we'll be left out on a limb. So this was our way of also managing our relationship with China. If President Trump can keep saying, I have a wonderful relationship with Xi Jinping, I have great respect for him, we're going to have a wonderful trade deal, and if Abe goes and endorses the BRI, and we know how deeply Australia and China are tied to each other in terms of trade and everything else. So we have also then to play a more sophisticated game. So while Prime Minister's speech may create some confusion, but I don't think that we should worry too much about it, or anybody should worry too much about it, because it is the facts on the ground and what we do in reality which is much more important than what we say, just like the Chinese. They do say one thing and do another. That's part of the game. And finally, the Indo-Pacific concept, how much we put all our geopolitical interests in that basket has to be also then weighed against the other forums in which we are building a relationship and where we have some common interests, whether it is the RIC dialogue or the BRICS or the SCO. So we have to maintain a certain balance in our foreign policy. So we have to play in many forums and simultaneously support and promote concepts which, taken together, help us to maintain better our security and also, to my mind, although this is a contested phrase, our strategic autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sibyl. It's been a very comprehensive address to the aspects given, and I think it gives us complete enlightenment on the aspects, right from the ambiguities, the ambivalence, the equilibrium that goes with these policies and how we prosecute it in terms of strategies and options. I now hand over to Professor Ashok Kapoor to address the aspects of growing entanglements in the Asia-Pacific region.
It's wonderful to be here and to honor the memory of my good friend Professor M.L.Sondhi. We were not only friends but collaborators in all kinds of things, nuclear issues and China as well as other things. So it's a great opportunity for me to thank his, to acknowledge his memory. He was a real visionary. He was thinking 10, 20 years ahead of his time, and I was fortunate to be the beneficiary of some of his ideas. Now to turn to the Indo-Pacific region, and I won't say spend too much time on geopolitics because that's well-known ideas, but we can always revert to it in discussion. Now, the Indo-Pacific region, the time frame which is of interest to me is the period 2017 to 2019 now, and still evolving. Now, if you recall that at the Davos conference in 2017, there was widespread belief that America was declining, it was protectionist, it was anti-NATO, it was unlikely to be a world leader, a number one world leader, and President Xi had no embarrassment in saying, we are going to be number one. He was quite open about it, unlike his predecessors, Deng Xiaoping, who had advised, be humble, in summary. And I'll revert to that also. So Xi was quite open in acknowledging his number one position, and Angela Merkel also did the same. The Time magazine declared these two as the successors to Trump. This is all 2017. Within 1 year, the dynamics started to change. And they started to change not only in the IPR region, but they started to change in Europe as well. Trump, with his usual bluster, clumsy, rough language, vulgar, he told the NATO allies that it is not acceptable that you are getting a free ride on the back of the American taxpayer, and you have to pay up. They laughed at him and tried to isolate him, but Trump got his way. Guess what? All of them, and he shamed them. He would name countries like Canada, Germany, and others who had not paid up their 2% share for the NATO alliance. And within 1 year, that's the Trump effect, which I want to bring to your attention despite his clumsiness. The Trump effect, within 1 year, NATO received $100 billion from these delinquent countries. Now, I don't know if that is reported here in the press, but he got his way, and he said, they are not going to be fighting Russia on my back. No more. Positive, constructive action by Trump. Then we come to the issue of China's rise. Now, China's rise is a very interesting topic, because China's rise created a debate within China among the Chinese scholars. Now, what were they arguing? They said, this is 2003, I believe, that was. The peaceful rise debate created 4 controversies within China. The first one was that it creates very bad optics. It suggests thrusting up, and that's not a very good optic. But that's not the main thing. The other points they made is that a rise of a power is anti-historical. Which country has risen to power by peaceful means? Power is taken, never given. And so what does China have to take power? Mao did take power. He took power. And this is not a historical inevitability. Then they raised 2 other concrete issues which are relevant today. These are Chinese scholars. They said, if you keep talking about peaceful rise and peaceful development, you are, in a way, putting aside our option to liberate Taiwan, which is their core interest, along with Tibet and with Xinjiang. So that became a concrete issue. And then the fourth element in the debate was that it became a part of Chinese bureaucratic politics. The Chinese military, if you believe in peaceful rise, then why do you need a big military? Right? And in the bureaucratic politics, the claim for the military to have more money is based on dangerous environment, not a suggestion of peaceful rise. Now, this debate of peaceful rise or peaceful development, it was shifted from peaceful rise within a year to peaceful development. And language matters. Language matters. Now, in the peaceful development, there was a further debate. And the further debate was that Deng Xiaoping had counseled in 1989, he said China has to have a very subtle strategy. It was more or less a camouflage strategy. It should have a sober attitude towards war, and China needs a supportive international environment to develop its economy, to pursue its social contract with its people, which is you have a strong economy, we'll take care of you, and please don't bother us about the political leadership and communism. So these are important issues there, which are still in play. And as China's economy weakens, it has weakened, I'll come to this, 2019 is seen in the West as a period, according to the international economists, period where China's economy is weakening. And China now Xi has advised his cadres that we are in a dangerous period. We are facing many fronts around us. Economic front, military front on the South China Sea, and of course the diplomatic front. Now, so this is one dimension of what is happening, evolving within China in terms of their internal politics. And my concern is that I don't think people in India, I was yesterday at JNU, and I asked the students there, PhD students, how much of work is going on the study of internal politics? Very little. And if you don't have academics doing that, I'm hoping that the MEA professionals will have the time to study this thing in depth and find out what the inner dynamics of Chinese politics is. Because unless you discover the inner dynamics, you cannot discover the points of pressure. It's no use talking for the ambassadors to talk to each other without knowing where are the weaknesses of the other side. And here one must learn from the Chinese. Now, Chinese believe, if you recall Sun Tzu, they believe in psychological warfare. They believe in disorienting the enemy. They believe in seducing the enemy with all kinds of different forms. And of course, fighting is the last resort for the Chinese generals and in Chinese way of looking at it. Okay, now, what is so the internal debate is one dimension. Now enters Trump. Now Trump in America is known as the disruptor in chief. That's what he does. That's the way he built his construction empire. He disrupts. He's crude, as I mentioned, and he disrupts. Now, Trump has confused the Chinese with his actions. Now, the difference is the Chinese leadership was acting on the basis of Obama's strategic patience. Do nothing. Watch them evolve. The idea behind strategic patience comes from the assumption by Bill Clinton when he allowed China to join the World Trading Organization. The expectation was that China would join the world community, join the global economic globalization. It would gain from it, and its nationalism would be tamed, and China would become a stakeholder in the world community. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. It made a lot of money, trade imbalances, intellectual property theft, right? Which the controversy over, I can't pronounce this, Hawaii, the 5G company, and I'll come to that because that's very significant what's going on now. So with this, China claimed to be a non-market economy, benefiting from the World Trade rules, WTO rules, but it is. Trump came out and his advisors pulled out all kinds of data showing we are not benefiting from this. China has done it with unfair practices. Now, the point I want to raise here is Trump is the first U.S. president to directly confront the Chinese leadership. First one. He's doing one-on-one, and he's removed the Chinese belief in practicing calculated ambiguity. Because American trade negotiators arrive in Beijing with their data and say, this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing, and it's an evidence-based thing. Bluster from Trump, but evidence-based interaction but among the trade negotiators from Washington. Okay, now what is this doing? It has confronted Xi with a huge problem because Trump has placed tariffs. The tariffs are hurting the Chinese economy. But he also throws a little olive branch saying, oh, well, if you agree to this thing, and I will remove the tariffs. He's a bully, no doubt about it. But if you do that, I will remove the tariffs. And if you don't, and then from time to time, if we need 1 month more to negotiate, we can go forward. But between 2017 and 2019, the dynamics have changed. So, and this is ongoing process. Trump may get impeached tomorrow, and then we need a new seminar. But as long as he's there, he is determined to pursue this. And he's doing this now, not only in the context of Indo-Pacific region or Asia-Pacific, whatever your preference is. He's doing it on a global scale, with a focus on IPR, but with international implications. How so? The whole issue of intellectual property theft and Hawaii. Now, you are all aware, I'm sure, that the daughter of the founder of Hawaii is sitting in Canada on bail, right? Now, what was the issue there? She was arrested in transit on an American warrant, and the issue was that allegedly, she was involved in busting Iran sanctions. Okay? So the network of the US Treasury is very long. So if they impose sanctions on Iran, anybody involved in busting Iran sanctions then gets into eventually American custody and then is in trouble. Here is a link. So it's not simply IPR. It is IPR and Iran on this particular issue, and the U.S. major Chinese corporation dealing with this particular issue. Okay, now when this thing happens, this kind of thing. Now, again, another effect of this thing is on this one issue of busting sanctions and finding a united front against on the issue of intellectual property theft, which is centered on Hawaii and others, involves the Europeans. Right now, USA, Australia, New Zealand, Japan are on board with the United States on the issue of Hawaii. They are there. UK on the fence, and Germany and France are beginning to lean. Because the US Secretary of State says, if you trade if you don't accept our view on this, you can no longer be a strategic partner. You have a choice: trade with China on this issue or trade with us. You have a choice. We are not going to put the gun to you, but you have to choose. Now, which country, tell me, we should do an analysis on this, which country in the world is going to say, no, we are not going to trade with the US? It's still the world's strongest economy, right? So one has to make a careful calculation of what is the calculation of countries who are working, who are very impressed with China, working with them on this trade issue, and if given a choice between trade with us or trade with them. And on this issue of intellectual property rights, if the US Treasury imposes sanctions, then it becomes a huge problem where people can be arrested and do that. So we've got concrete issues where the issue may be located in IPR, but it has international ramifications. I'll give you another example. When the United States wanted to place sanctions on North Korea, right? Surprise, surprise, their great buddy, North Korea's great buddy, China, joined the sanctions twice. Russia, who is a strategic rival of America, joined the sanctions twice. And Nikki Haley, the ambassador, now she stepped out, she said, I was leveraging Trump's unpredictability with members of the council. I was telling them, who knows, if you don't sign on, who knows what he'll do next? And she said it worked. The point I'm making is that when we talk about rising China and when we talk about China, the next world leader, I'm referring to the work by Martin Jacques, who said, the French fellow, who said, oh, well, China is number one anyway, and it's going to rule the world. The Middle Kingdom, he says, will rule the world. That's a subtitle of his book. Take a look at that book. The Middle Kingdom is going to rule the world. And now we are finding, well, that Middle Kingdom may have some feet of clay in certain areas. I'm not saying China is not a strong economy. I'm not saying China is not a strong military, but that it has some weaknesses there. Now let's still staying on the theme that the issues are in IPR, but the ramifications are international. Now, who is joining American ships and in the sending patrols into the South China Seas? List of countries. USA, obviously, and they've elevated their work by sending in ships into the Taiwan Strait. They didn't always used to do that, but now they are sending them into the Taiwan Strait, just to make sure that Xi doesn't get any big ideas about liberating Taiwan by force. And he has talked about it this year, 2019. Now, whether he's being desperate or whether it's a ritualistic statement, we don't know. And he took one step forward by saying Taiwan should accept the one China, two system Hong Kong model. The Taiwanese president immediately rejected it. Said, no way. We are totally different. We are a democracy. We are a capitalistic country. We have a strong economy, and we have the backing. She didn't say that, but we have the backing of the U.S. Congress, because they keep getting all their arms from Washington, from USA. Okay, so this one core interest of China is still up in the air. There's no guarantee it'll be able to liberate. But going back to the issue of patrolling, which are the countries which have now joined the Americans to patrol the South China Seas? Australia. And they're putting big money into the development of some of the islands in the South Pacific. Japan. India. Indian naval ships are floating all over Pacific. They go up to Japan, they go into the north of Australia, they are in South China Seas. The Vietnamese love the Indian ships, so we got all that going on. Vietnamese themselves don't send ships, but they're a bit nervous about what's going on in Taiwan and what's going on because the Vietnamese reacted to when Philippines president put his eggs in the China basket. So China has one major defector from the IPR and one all-weather friend, Pakistan, right, which remains to be seen how strong that bond is given the recent developments where the Chinese were not exactly endorsing the, with their calculated ambiguity, they didn't quite endorse all that. But now North Korea is up in the air, which used to be a relationship of lips to teeth, according to the Chinese. But guess what? What is the bargain Trump is offering? Denuclearize and we will rebuild North Korea. And this is the British press now commenting on it, that Trump seems to have guessed that Kim is more interested in money than he's in missiles. To be tested. Are you addicted to missiles or are you addicted to some some economic development and regime security? Now, the 1 minute.
Sure, sir.
The the summit yesterday failed. We all acknowledge that. But look at what he has achieved. What has been achieved? He got North Korea to halt testing, missile testing. They were sending all over Hawaii and Japan and all that. That stopped. They even blew up one of their obsolete facilities, symbolic gesture, doesn't change the military balance in any way. They returned American hostages, which is very important in American politics. They returned the remains of American soldiers from the Korean War, very important in American politics. And they got, as I mentioned, the UN support against sanctions on North Korea, and they are hurting. Those sanctions are hurting. There's some slippage by China and others, but the sanctions are hurting. And of course, Trump is always bragging about his wonderful chemistry with Xi and with Kim. That goes on and on. So all I want to close on this one point, that Chinese diplomatic tactics, which worked very well in the past, are no longer working because of direct confrontations, right? And that the issues which are coming up, Trump is building slowly a coalition of international forces, issue-oriented, North Korean missiles, Hawaii, global intellectual property threat, and that seems to be the pattern of engagement which is emerging to isolate Iran. That's where he wants regime change. They've said it. Pompeo has in a way acknowledged that, but no regime change in North Korea. So there are subtle differences in play here. And when I started studying Trump, I thought, oh my God, he's not going to last very long. He's an awful fellow. But now I'm beginning to realize that there are enormous subtleties in his actions, and Trump seems to have an intuitive idea of what to do to put others under pressure. One last thing. There's a book by an international economist, I believe he's U.S., George Magnus. I don't know if you read that. Yale University Press, last year. Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. Based on economic analysis, not political rhetoric, not the stuff I'm talking about, but hard economic rhetoric, showing all kinds of dilemmas for Chinese. So forget about the dilemma that the Chinese ships would have of the Malacca Strait and going into the Indian Ocean, but consider the internal politics. And I urge you to look at changes within China. Thank you very much. Sorry I've taken a bit longer.
Thank you, Professor Kapoor, for a very exhaustive coverage and bringing into relevance the contextualizing the other events in this perspective. The last part is mine, and that says security challenges, options, and strategy. I would compress that a bit, since a number of challenges have been covered by Ambassador Sybil, Professor Kapoor, and I'll just come down to the security dimension. But I would start that with bringing into perspective the US National Security Strategy in December 17, which actually is the start point of this change. Well, the thought has begun much earlier, and 2014, Prime Minister Modi, in his inaugural address in the US, had simply said that India is ready and responsible to take on its responsibilities and in the Indian Ocean. But gradually it changed, because all these political engagements did bring to fructify the National Defense Security Strategy of US. And I think 3 or 4 elements need to be understood, and I'm making that the beginning of my part so that we culminate to where the challenges for Indian security are. In the components of the NSS, National Security Strategy of US, we have India is central to America's Indo-Pacific strategy. Second, it's the most important and key element of a security architecture in this region. Third, the US views the Indo-Pacific more security architecture than geographical space. And fourth, it addresses a balance of power against China. It also considers that ASEAN will be focused and addressed in this leadership, and finally that the Quad mechanism will be a potent and enabling mechanism that will give strength to the US. A huge perspective covered, and without doubt, while it addresses the Sinocentricity, it addresses the America First concept in every approach. I think that cannot be missed out. It would have amplified a little, but because of time compression. So what emerged in 2014 onwards consequent to this? How did India actually respond from a military perspective and a security challenge? And I had written 3-4 things that I must share with you. While at the face of it, India's perceptions of geo-economic interests, good order of sea, and freedom of navigation was the intent, I think the core. Considering that you were now a partner into the national security of US, an extra-regional power, the challenge was, how do you integrate it? But it had to take steps. And some of the steps that come straight to my mind are that New Delhi had to, I repeat, had to think of a credible deterrence in this nature, in this sphere and region. Third, from a maritime domain that we actually possess, vis-a-vis the capability of a rise of China, which can produce almost a ship every alternate day today, I think the comparison is vast. Third, while the construct provides India as a valuable opportunity and partner, it involves India's shoulders to manage a responsibility coming virtually overnight by an extra-regional power to shoulder more than it probably can today. I think, and that is why there was jet setting. A number of delegations have come into India and from India to US. And in one of the congressional delegations that I had met in a closed door discussion, from a security perspective, I only put across 2 points which are very relevant to my perspective here. First, while you construct a political domain of an India-Pacific nature that covers 2/3 of the world really, of the global domain, how does just India-Pacific Command or Indo-Pacific Command actually bring into effect the ability to question the Chinese influence and coordinate with the Americans to bring a balance of power? Simultaneously, we also had extended the maritime domain of the Indian Navy. and we've taken it ourselves as far as the African coast. When we do this, the essential disparities that come into these two domains are 4, 5, and I think that's where we need to focus upon. There is convergence in thought and process, but the convergence in capability building and ability to actually prosecute this strategy is vastly differential. When I questioned that, one of the main concerns is, how does this massive maritime domain get a balance between the US and India? Maybe later France and others have moved in later, and with Japan. How do we set out a network? Third, the Pacific Command, which only looked at its Western Pacific, was extended to the west coast of India, but that was not enough, because India's domain must cover those powers that are integral to China and intervention into the Indian Ocean, and that's Pakistan. And I think if this major central power that was key to US projection at one time and today is on the other side of the block with China, I think this was being left out. So I think this is the fourth disparity that rises in our capability. We also have China's interventions through Bangladesh, through Myanmar, and as Ambassador Sybil said, in a very big way through Gwadar, and I believe there's another naval base in the offing 80 miles somewhere close to Gwadar itself. If this is the kind of intervention by China into the Indian Ocean, we really have to look at our capability to coordinate with the West Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and this critical region in which the potential for conflict directly impact India will be much higher. 2, 3 more points then come up is, what is the force levels that India has today in its navy in the Indian Ocean? We have had very good series of exercises, we have had cooperation, and we are in the process of virtually assuming a responsibility of regional security provider or a net security provider. Militarily, I think the whole onus comes on the maritime domain. Very little comes on the land borders or on the land territories. Being a military man myself, we've analyzed that if you were to put the impact of this out into effect, it would be a maritime cooperation that would be more dominant than a land-based cooperation. So I would just summarize to say, is Quad an automatic capability building for India? The kind of alliances that India has with each one of them, and yet if you go into the depth, there is lack and voids in the integration of all four as a regional force, really. Finally, it will be important to also understand, is India going to prosecute this capability always as a subset of the American Indo-Pacific strategy? Or will it be capable of taking on or assuming a strategy that actually focuses on India's interests? And I think that's where the huge domain lies. If this was to be put into effect, I think while the world does concede to India the power that it has and the essence of its thought process in stabilizing the region, in keeping the region open, and in extending its willingness to participate and show the freedom of seas right through South China Sea and integrate with Australia and other countries, I think it is actually inflicting upon itself a responsibility that today it may not be able to undertake. Very senior ambassadors sitting here, and my suspicion is always that while policies can come up as new concepts over the couple of years, I won't say overnight, but just like the Indo-Pacific did shift suddenly from the Asia-Pacific because it needed a change, the ability to put effect and flesh to this strategy is not really easy, particularly on a junior partner. India has its own challenges, and let me also remind the audience that while all other countries are engaged India is the only one that has a land dispute directly with China. While India would say in a strategic perspective that when you can't address your strategic land threats, it will be right to extend your domain like any other, when we go into a strategic war, you extend your domains into other regions. Well, that's what India has done. But does it truly empower India by keeping it with its capability in focus? Does it give us the ability to handle a land threat and a threat in this region is what is towards the penultimate question. And I think with these security challenges, where do we then go from here? And since I have a word, so I'm not inflecting any strategy that's as black and white as it looks, because I clearly see the deficit, a strategic deficit there. India is unable to project itself in the seas as yet. India's just managing to hold out China on its land threats. And India's coping with a serious issue with Pakistan. With the kind of budgeting and defense budgeting we have, are we capable of putting our whole power and will effectively into this thought process? A very important question that was then asked by the US Congress, and my response was something that's not easily doable less than 5 to 10 years from now. And that was, if you would just extend the responsibility of the Pacific Command, the PACOM, into an Indo-Pacific Command, have you then given two things: additional resources of the Navy to manage this, additional budgeting to organize a kind of infrastructure that can manage this region? And if you haven't done both, India would fall short of expectations, because the reality is that we have limitations yet. And therefore, I think it's a huge security challenge. While it's good to be on their side, and I think finally, Prime Minister Modi's declarations at the Shangri-La conference were probably in this perspective, and he stepped back from what he said in 2015, that India is ready to undertake its responsibilities in the ocean region, to a rebalancing strategy where it said that we are part of this strategy, but to an extent, and we could also look at integrating China into it, which is what is the ambivalence, the ambiguity that both the previous speakers have highlighted. That if you have this ambiguity at a strategic leadership level, moving forward, the security challenge becomes even more difficult. My last line of summary is a very important point raised by Ambassador Sybil, and that was about the Russian factor. And I actually consider that Russia is a huge factor in any dynamics against China. I'm doing India-Russia relations from two perspectives in great depth, and I realize every time that Russia cannot be let go from the dynamics of Indian foreign policy. And if Indian foreign policy can be integrated, or at least keep Russia on board, how we do that is a challenge to our leadership and diplomacy. But the fact is that we as the militaries, or in security perspectives, would not like to let them go off. Gone are those days and old statements of depending on them on our legacy equipment. But I think if you look at future equipment and defense, and if you look at S-400, or if you're looking at the FICV, or the future tanks that we are talking about, engagement, or the future aircraft that we are thinking about, Russia is somebody who we must have on our side. Russia's South Asia strategy is well established. Russia's East Asian strategy is well established, and I have studied the impact of this in my domain of effecting India's capability of how it will participate in this. With those words, I will come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Before we come to the Q&A, I'm sorry we were a bit late. We have with us a very eminent person, Mr. Prem Shankar Jha, who needs no introduction really, and who would like to give this discussion an economic or even important more perspective. Sir, we have only 5 minutes. May I request?
General, thank you. if you give me 6, but I promise it will not be 7.
Brevity has certain advantages, so I don't have to go into details. I'm just going to give you broad ideas of what I've heard here and what I agree with and what bothers me from what I've heard. First is, I thought for about 2/3, right almost to the end, whether I was really, where was I sitting? Where was this conference taking place? Was it taking place in Delhi or was it taking place in Washington? And I finally came to the conclusion that this was a conference taking place in Washington, not in Delhi. Because till about 5 minutes before the end, when General Lamba actually began to touch the issues that bother me, I never heard the word India security. It was taken for granted that our security is reinforced by belonging to a US, European, Australian, Japanese coalition. It was taken for granted that our main enemy, inveterate always enemy, is China. And therefore that we really need to do this. There were a few sort of momentary notes of discord with this theme. One was from Kamal himself, who said, but you know, everything we are doing, the Bay of Bengal is a peaceful ocean. All our threats are on the west. So then what is the logic of Indo-Pacific? And frankly, in the entire discussion, I didn't find any. I'm not going to go into these. I'm not going to go into in detail what has been said here. I'm going to talk about a different perspective on what's happening in the world, which might give you a different perspective on the way that China is behaving and may help you to understand China a bit more. I should mention in passing that I have actually written 3 books on this subject, on various stages of China's transition and its political economic impact upon its political economy upon its international strategy. If you ever want to look at them, please go ahead. No one has the time, but if you do have the time, please go ahead. Okay, anyway, look, what is the phase of the world today? We are going through a hegemonic struggle again. For 100 years, the great world hegemon was Britain till the First World War. Till after that, it was America. And now that is again beginning to be challenged, and the challenge is becoming increasingly serious, and the battle lines are getting drawn more and more sharply, and we are, at this moment, we placed ourselves not in the middle, not equidistant, not somewhere away from, or even balancing between the two, but squarely on one side of it, and it happens to be the losing side. Why do I say this? Because we are in the 4th phase of rapid industrialization, globalization, where national boundaries are all being smashed. The previous phase was the phase of the nation state. In the period of the nation state, the core of power was industry, and all the relationships you made out of that, an industrial power were made to secure markets or raw materials, both of which brought you into conflict with other industrializing countries which had an industrial core and were trying to expand outwards. And that was the reason for both the First and Second World Wars, as you know perfectly well. Today, we are in the era of globalization, and there's one very, very big difference between the Sino-US hegemonic struggle and anything that preceded it. China has built its strength not on military strength, but on trade. For China, China's power is based entirely upon its economic success, its success in trade. It's $4 trillion of reserves are built on that, and nothing destroys trade more quickly than war. So the country that has the vastest interest, most powerful basic interest in peace today is actually China. And the country that has the greatest interest in war is the one that is losing its hegemony because of this economic onslaught of the Chinese, which is the US, and to a lesser extent the European Union. We are now with them in this. I think we need to bear this in mind. And another thing that we do need to bear in mind is that in this process of joining up with this so-called Indo-Pacific, it's a lovely thing. 6 million of our people are in America. All our elite wants to go and stay with their children after they retire here. America is paradise for our elite here, but it isn't paradise for our country. Is there one single instance in which the Americans have actually stood up for us in any way? Look at the text of the Security Council resolution that was passed on Pulwama. There's no reference to Pakistan. There's not even an acceptance that the Jaish-e-Mohammed did this. It says Jaish-e-Mohammed claims to do this. There is a condemnation of the act of terrorism in Pulwama, but not of the Jaish-e-Mohammed by itself. Just said Jaish claims this. Therefore, by implication, if this is true, then we condemn them. If this is true. There is no, you look anywhere else, you will find the same situation. In our trade with Iran, have we got any kind of, we've got a minute sort of 6-month window that they've given us to fall in line with precisely what Professor Kapoor was talking about. Otherwise, God alone knows what will happen to us. This is our major defense partner and ally talking with us. On the other hand, we have cut ourselves away gradually from Russia. And I completely agree with General Lamba. We do need the Russians on our side. And what is much more important, we most emphatically do not need the Russians on the Chinese side. Finally, I want to give me 2 minutes more, if you have, General Lamba. I want to talk about the Chinese economic compulsions that we have. China can become aggressive. And the reason is that internally they face a huge problem of excess capacity in their mother industries, which they put up in the last 5 years. Huge expansion, 300,000 megawatts of power, which not 1 watt is being used, was necessary or is being used today. 1.6, they added 600 million tons of steel capacity, which they are now cutting back 2/3 of that under international pressure. So, but the question is, how do they keep their workers employed? Because the one thing the Chinese cannot afford to do is to make them unemployed. This is their problem, and this is the actual origin of the BRI. There are 2 origins of the BRI. Just 2 minutes. I think there is an important point, General, which you now don't hear. Therefore, please give me the extra 2 months. Right. You will not hear it again for the next 5 seminars, I guarantee you. So please just let me say this. Look, the Chinese today are feeling very threatened, because around them there are 400 military installations of the US. The South China Sea, they don't want no traffic there. They don't want to control it. They don't want to block off the Chinese Sea, whatever the Americans maybe say. All their trade comes through there. They need that trade because that is where all their oil and all their raw materials come from, as well as their semi-finished parts now increasingly from ASEAN. So what they want is a certain measure to be ensured that this South China Sea will not be used for military purposes. And the 12-mile limit makes no sense now when a single American submarine has 155 Tomahawk missiles on it with a range of 690 miles. One submarine is capable of destroying 70% of China's industry. That is the actual power differential we have today, if pure destruction is your purpose. And yes, the Chinese are very worried that the Americans, one way or the other, sooner or later, rather than lose power, will find an excuse for war. So, with 2 things are happening simultaneously. You have to find another justification, another reason for the mandate of heaven to stay with the Communist Party in the face of rising unemployment. And you're doing your best to limit this by going through the BRI, using your foreign exchange reserves for that. The other is that you have got to do something in order to minimize this danger. So what do? You try and push the warship access to the Chinese coast beyond 600 miles. which is the logic of the South China Sea, what they're doing, and they will continue doing it. Now, in order to be able to do this, they will use the patriotism or jingoism that comes out of this attempt in order to keep the unemployed and the increasingly miserized people, because of the excess capacity that there is in China today, in line. And this is the game they will be playing. It is a game in which India can help them by actually taking $1 trillion worth of investment from them. And we won't be damn fools like Sri Lanka. I mean, I would never have taken the Hambantota project, and my knowledge of economics is not that of a project manager, let us say. It's an insane project to take 90% of the cost at a 6% interest rate for infrastructure. Now, anyway, the point is that we are one country that can make use of the investment that China wants to make abroad. We don't do it. So who do we impoverish? Not us sitting in this room. All of us are comfortable. But look at the agricultural crisis. Look at the industrial crisis. Look at the fact that 1.1 million industrial units have closed down. Look at the fact that 11 million people have lost their jobs in industry in the last 6 years. Then you see who are the people who we are not talking for. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Brought in very relevant points. The House is open. You can ask questions.
The Indian knowledge of what we are doing with Trump, Quad, the general, everything, is very, very clear. Is it clear what happened between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping at Wuhan? Could anyone just enlighten us? Because it was not publicized at all. But we seem to see that there were some agreements of calming down between China and India on the oceans and on the border. Wuhan.
On Gwadar River. Thank you.
Let me take the opportunity to congratulate all the panelists, esteemed panelists. My question is, what is the motive that we are aiming at with Indo-Pacific or Quad? Is it balance of power or deterrence? Mind you, these are two important yet different things. And I could not differentiate what was the importance on balance of power or deterrence.
Thank you all the panelists. It was so enlightening. By the way, yes, my name is Hari. I look after political affairs in the Embassy of Nepal. Indo-Pacific, just out of my curiosity, I'm asking this. The Indo-Pacific has come as a concept, and still it's a kind of it's a kind of hedge. And General Lamba said there is lots of confusion still. Yet, how do you see the future of Indo-Pacific? Where will it be heading? Will there be some kind of institutionalization, let's say, or some kind of solid, visible alliance sort of thing? What will be the future? Related to this, what it means, what Indo-Pacific means, or let's say the future of Indo-Pacific means, whatever the direction, for the smaller countries in the region, the countries which have significant amount of relation with, let's say, all major and regional powers in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take on these 4 questions. First one is about Wuhan and its agenda. And first we could take, and the motive of Indo-Pacific, is it Quad's balance of power? May I request Ambassador Sybil if you could like to.
I don't think we made any disclosure at the official level about what transpired at Wuhan. All I can say, based on my conversation with people who organized this at the bureaucratic level, is that at Wuhan, strictly bilateral issues were not discussed. Which is why this NSG business and 1267 UN Committee for Designating International Terrorists, on all these issues there has been no change. Not in Chinese position. On the contrary, they have reiterated these positions more than once. And if you see that after Wuhan, they started a new bus service through POK to Xinjiang. So if the whole idea was that neither side should do anything on the ground or take steps which create more concern, then obviously the Chinese did not particularly bother about this. And then they have protested very strongly when our Prime Minister went to Arunachal Pradesh. So, having said that, now I will give you my view, which is not based on any feedback or information I have at the official level, is that from our side we wanted to lower tensions with China as much as possible, keeping in view the elections. That any incident on the border or tensions on the border would not be helpful. And not that Mr. Modi said to Xi Jinping, don't do anything on the border while having an election, but the whole purpose was at the highest level to engage Xi Jinping and create an atmosphere in which the likelihood of a Chinese physical challenge on the border or another incident of that nature would be avoided. And the second would be, as part of our strategic autonomy, that while China has got the message that we've signed these foundational agreements with the United States, we are a major defense partner, we're buying a lot of equipment from China. A lot of it is meant to boost our defenses in the north. That message China is getting. At the same time, do the other thing of reaching out to China. That it's not that we want a conflict or we want to move towards that, and keep them engaged. So this is a subtle kind of balancing that the Chinese continue to do. They keep on bolstering their relationship with Pakistan in every way, and yet they reach out to us and speak a certain kind of language to us, which shows that their policy towards us are benign. So if they can play this game, we can play this game too. With regard to Gwadar as a naval base, I think it was rightly said that there is one more area.
Jelani.
Yeah, that is more likely to be to become a naval base. On the other hand, the fact is whether it is Gwadar or the other place. Jelani, it doesn't really matter. That's a matter of detail. One is that you have some kind of a naval, you have a facility where your submarines can dock and some fuel and food and everything else can be taken on board, but there is no servicing facility. There is no because I am told that the submarines, I don't know the naval people here, need a huge amount of attention and upkeep and maintenance and everything else. So if you want to really have more than simply a place where your submarines can come, you need to create facilities. For that you need to control the hinterland. You cannot create these facilities elsewhere. Now Gwadar or Jelani or whatever else is the only place where they control the hinterland, right from Xinjiang to the CPC to Gwadar or elsewhere. So they can build up actual facilities where their submarines can be serviced. So therefore, I'm not an expert, but my own view is they'll do it. If they can do it in Djibouti, why can't they do it in Pakistan? What's the difficulty? They can't do it in Myanmar, they can't do it in Sri Lanka, but in Pakistan they can do it. Insofar as balance of power and deterrence is concerned, I'm not an expert in these kind of semantics, but I see that balance of power itself is a deterrent. If there's a balance of power, then naturally no country can then hope to dominate because they are countered. So that's a deterrent. So I don't know what fine distinction is being made between balance of power and deterrence. Finally, future of Indo-Pacific, institutionalized and this and that. Well, in some ways, it's not been institutionalized, but the fact that US and India are cooperating and the foundational agreements and everything that we have done, logistic support, interoperability, we are now willing to look at PECA. Our defense minister has said that publicly. All the equipment, P-18 maritime aircraft that we have bought, agreements on maritime domain awareness, all these are part of, if not of a institutionalized cooperation between India and the United States, in which Japan has now been included. Australia so far has not been included in this, but maybe it will. But at the political level, we've had 3 rounds of the Quad dialogue already. So I think the future of the Indo-Pacific is quite clear. It will continue to keep a certain momentum, but it is not going to be, it will not evolve into an alliance of any kind. I don't think we are ready for that or we want that. And as far as smaller countries are concerned, I think Nepal should not be bothered. You are a landlocked country, so I don't think you should worry about the Indo-Pacific. But Sri Lanka and Maldives and countries like Myanmar, Bangladesh, they would have to, we will have to engage with them, they'll have to engage with us, more particularly Sri Lanka and Maldives with regard to Chinese maritime ambitions in this area. Nepal, I mean, saying in a light-hearted way, since you have now want to develop a link between Nepal and Shanghai, so I suppose Western Pacific becomes more important to you.
Well said, sir. Thank you very much. Professor Kapoor, would you
Yeah,
like to
just
say
a few comments. Sorry. Yeah, just a few comments. Starting with the last comment, balance of power or deterrence. I don't think that those are the issues. The issue now is, as far as I see, he called it Washington perspective, but that could also be the European and Canadian and Japanese and other perspectives. To create a new paradigm in the policies of North Korea and China. That, from what I can gather, in terms of the attention being given to these, in terms of the dynamics, those seem to be the 2 targets, not the balance of power or that. And I reject Mr. Jha's premise that America will go to war because it's losing. I'm sorry if I misunderstood.
I didn't quite say that, but that there's a tendency, attraction for that idea, that's all.
Yeah, could be, okay. But I'm staying away from any war scenario because last year, Trump administration gave a lot of money, $700 billion to the Pentagon, to build up, includes naval development. So they are focusing very much on that. So America sees itself as still #1 military power and sees itself as maintaining that military power. But that's not the end of their thinking, as I can determine. They want to open up new frontiers, and North Vietnam is a new frontier. Trump keeps talking about beautiful beaches there, so imagine him thinking of his Trump hotel there. But the point is, the South Koreans and Japanese would all be interested in investing, and Americans of course, in North Korea. So the messaging there is peaceful development of North Korea rather than war. And so it's seeking a transformation away from missiles into capitalism. And the choice of Hanoi was very interesting because the North Koreans were hearing from the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese told them, we fought on Americans, think in terms of developing a socialist economy. They're still communists, but develop a capitalistic economy. So Vietnam is being projected as a model, not Hong Kong. Okay, so in this case, I'm widening the network of what are the aims of IP. And the second, which is a much harder job, is to change the thinking of the Chinese themselves, the Chinese leadership. And here, keep in mind that historically and even now, China does not acknowledge any limits to its expansion. And Mr. Modi has also talked about, in the past, about in his conversation with Xi about expansionistic tendencies. So there is a thinking that China has to be encouraged to rethink its policy and encouraged to rethink the effects of its actions. It may regard itself as very benign, but actually others do not see it that way. For instance, it has not acknowledged willingness to give up its claims to the islands, Japanese islands. The only country, as I mentioned, which has moved towards it is Philippines. But Philippines territorial claims against China were arbitrated by the World Court, and they voted in favor of Philippines. But Philippines didn't want to pursue it. So these are the kinds of things which are being done. So America wants to maintain its premier position in the Pacific, and to change the thought process of the Chinese. Now, one last point. Mr. Jha said they believe in globalization, yes, and PRC power is based on, if I read him correctly, on trade. True. But also along with that came Mr. Deng Xiaoping's view that there should be military development as well. So strong economy is good to fulfill the social contract with the Chinese people, because to give them a stake in the system, but also it is to produce the finances for their military development. So it's not a trade-only policy. But having said this, I agree that, for instance, China would not have any interest in disrupting the economic corridor with Pakistan. That's in a way, their lifeline towards the Arabian Sea, right? Gwadar, to me, despite their heavy investment there in Hambuto, they would have a huge problem, and I wish some naval planner would enter the discussion here, would have a huge problem going from China through the Malacca Straits, through the Indian Ocean to reach Gwadar and the other associated place, and Hambutu. So I'm not sure what the Chinese thinking is in developing their naval position. Last comment, Bay of Bengal, the Indian government recently announced an expansion of a base there. So I disagree on that point, that Bay of Bengal is calm. It's not. Bay of Bengal, the Chinese used to be sending their submarines long time ago to survey the Indian Ocean, including the Bay of Bengal. Talk to the Navy chaps and they will tell you that why would the Indian government build a new base in the Bay of Bengal? Partly to keep an eye on Myanmar development, because the Chinese are building there. So I think it's very intricate, but the aim is to open up discussion rather than to start a war. And I reject the premise that America sees itself, or the world sees itself, as a declining power, and that they will start a war because they are a declining power. China is, in the time frame I mentioned, 2017 to 2019, the whole thinking has changed. And I would urge Mr. Jha to go and talk to the people in Davos, not Washington, D.C.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I just make two small comments, and I think we'll be coming right on time. So I think it's really behind time, about half an hour.
1 minute.
Okay, sir. Okay, right. So 2 points on that, Gwadar and Jalani. I think nobody mentioned it's a submarine base, but I think seeing the way China has learned to project itself, it should not be considered an impossibility. They are capable of evolving islands that get militarized in a couple of years. And to make anything out of whether it's Jalani or it's Gwadar, the use can be optimized and maximized. And I think that is definitely open for those of you who think it can't be used. You have a point. Finally, I think it's important to also, before I conclude, I'll give a chance to Mr. Prem Shantaja, but it's important to see the perspective from India, where really I think the focus of the seminar was, what are India's perceptions, whether it's terms of challenges, policy challenges, issues, strategy, and options that we have taken, which we have done well. Before I invite you all for lunch, I think Mr. Jha is pressing for a minute. We give him precisely a minute to make a point.
Before he makes the point, one.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Which is that why should we be perturbed if the US threatens China?
I need 2 minutes, one for each of them, because the question is also aimed at me.
Go ahead.
The question is also aimed at me, therefore I would like to take 2 minutes, if you don't mind. First, we keep talking about Gwadar as if it's a sort of something, an isolated thing. Gwadar is the end of the CPEC corridor. The CPEC corridor is a back door for trade for China. You're forgetting that, which is why, strange, but we haven't yet seen a submarine base coming up there. I'm not surprised at all.
Submarine base is coming up at Ormara. You can go
Fair enough, but I'm talking of Gwadar just now. I'm not saying that it will not happen elsewhere, but the question is, I'm just talking, we need to get away from this exclusively militaristic view that we're taking here. And as for the Chinese, why should we be worried if the Chinese and the US are taking this on? Because unfortunately, both are nuclear powers, and no war has taken place in the last 100 years where the country that went to war has benefited from it. It's always been the country that's been worst hit. And by the same token, no war has taken place in the last 100 years in which the unforeseen causes prolonged it. The First World War was supposed to finish in 4 weeks, if you remember. The Second World War, I cannot tell. But the fact is that we please do not underestimate the possibility of a conflict coming out of increasing pressure on China to strangle its trade. And everything I heard from Professor Kapoor was strangling Chinese trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again for all of you to be here, spare your time and join us and enrich the discussion with your observations and comments. May I now request you all to join us for lunch. Thank you.